Welcome back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm your host, Stephen Roy Goodman. Today we're going to be speaking about the consumption of news through social media. Our first guest is a recent college graduate, of California State University, Northridge, Louise Zuniga. Louise, why don't you kick us off and get us started?
Social media is starting to become part of an everyday lifestyle, right? Whether you're just a regular common person or a huge corporation in this country, you're bound to use social media for something, right? Whether it's advertisement or in the case of news companies to promote different news articles and things that people should be informed about. Now, the only downside to it is that some people on social media, I don't know if it's just laziness, right? I think that plays a role in it, right? Especially for us young people. We don't always read the complete story, right? Sometimes people just see a headline and they think, okay, that's what it's all about. No, that's not the case. A quick example of that is this morning I saw the LA Galaxy was parting ways with one of their players for comments that their wife made regarding protesters. Um, that was it though, right? It was LA Galaxy parts ways with so and so due to wife's comments. Okay, what did the wife say? Right? What happened? Now, if you don't click on the story and you don't read the full story, then you're not going to be aware of what she said, the gravity, right? You're not going to be aware of what the player's opinions were on his wife's comments, and therefore a lot of people are just going to be left with, oh, they parted ways with it, but they don't know why, right? They don't know the context behind it. Um, and social media can also be tricky because it gives a lot of room for false information and a lot of false narratives. Recently, I saw a post with over 100,000 likes and retweets that took a scene from World War Z and made it appear as if MSNBC was broadcasting this footage, right? To say that that's what protesters around the country were doing and causing, right? And it was a chaotic scene. And hundreds of people I read throughout the comments were blasting MSNBC, saying that they produce fake news, right? But in reality, it was just somebody photoshopping that into an MSNBC title. So it's just a quick little show of how important it is to be able to tell what is accurate, right, on social media, and also to understand that you can't just go by what a headline says. You have to actually read into the story and get the full details to further understand the story. Otherwise, you're just going to be left with a little small glimpse.
Thank you, Louise. That was helpful. Great way to begin the discussion. We're now going to continue with Kim Meltzer, who's a professor of communication at Marymount University. Kim is also the faculty advisor to the student newspaper at Marymount. Kim, can you say a word or two about the pros and cons of getting news through social media?
One of the pros is you get to see what the people in your network are interested in and what they're talking about. But ideally, in a democracy, citizens are exposed to divergent or different points of view, not just those of the people we're friends with or who are in our family or who we know think like we do. And that's what helps us become better informed and have considered opinions, and then use those considered opinions, those informed opinions, when we make our voting decisions.
Are there things you suggest besides social media?
Rather than only going to social media for your news and seeing what your friends and people you know have been posting, how about also going to at least two other news sites that you trust and comparing the different accounts, the different versions of the news stories that you see across those different sites?
How important is it when a story was published?
That can be so important because we've heard stories of people we know who read a headline on social media, and then it turns out, and they retweet it or they repost it or they make a decision based on that headline or even that story. And then it's not until later on that they realize or find out that that story was from 5 years ago or 10 years ago it was originally published. And someone has just recently dredged it up and reposted it on social media to further some purpose or their own agenda.
Thank you, Kim. We're now going to turn to another faculty member. Colin teaches journalism at the University of Maryland, but when he's not teaching journalism at the University of Maryland, he is the director of multimedia at the Frederick News Post. So welcome, Graham. Graham, can you share with us your views about how your students consume news?
My students are generally in this new generation, not millennials, but Generation Z, I think is what most people are calling it. And media literacy does seem to be, something that they are giving a lot more thought to. This is a generation that came of age. They didn't know a time without cell phones and mobile information. And so one of the things that I'm teaching in the classroom is, from a production standpoint, is to be as transparent as possible, to make no decision, or for every decision that you make, you want to be looking at from a standpoint of, would the audience feel betrayed by the way that you are presenting the information? So if that means taking audio from one clip and then playing it under another one, just so that it makes a little bit more sense to the viewer, if they can tell that those images and the audio don't sync up, they can feel betrayed, and they won't trust you as a news source. So for me, making sure that students understand that really trust is really the most important thing that we have with our audience, because otherwise, they have no reason to keep coming back to us if they can't trust us.
So how do you encourage your students to build this trust?
I'm really just trying to get across that every decision that they make, they have to make it as if it's going to come to light, right? So for instance, later this week I'll be covering a protest in our city, and I plan to have a 360-degree little mini camera on top of one of my cameras, so that if anything happens, I can always point to that 360 video and be like, look, no, I'm not trying to distort the image. I'm not trying to make it appear as if there are more people than there actually were, or fewer people than there actually were, because there are certain techniques that a photographer, for instance, can make to distort the truth, right? So a lot of people have recently pointed to images during the coronavirus pandemic where a photographer using a long lens was looking down a beach, right? And so with that long telephoto lens, you end up sort of compressing the image and using a technique that's called forced perspective. And what happens there is, there are a few people who are becoming much more savvy with photography, and they're calling out when, like, look, we don't think that this accurately portrays the reality on the ground. And so it's really important to be transparent in kind of how we operate, the lenses that we use, and to think about how the audience is going to interpret the information that we're giving them. Because if they feel that what we're doing is trying to manipulate them, then they're just going to be completely turned off from your work.
Well, that's a really interesting point. Can you say another word or so about the type of lens that one could use?
Yeah, so to use that same example of a beach, or even some of the things that we've been seeing from, say, Ocean City, Maryland, on the boardwalk, is showing the number of people, right? So there's two different ways that you could go about that image. You could try to convey the number of people that were in that area by using, like we said, a long telephoto lens to compress the image. Or you could use a wide-angle image from the side that shows the space in between all of those people. And so it really depends on what you're trying to communicate, right? Because it's difficult to do both things. I mean, you could put a drone up in the air and look down and see the crowd of people and see how many people there are and say, wow, that was a lot of people. But you know what? They're wearing masks and they're 6 feet away. In this case, they mostly weren't, but then you would at least be able to see the space in between and say, okay, well, that's a lot of people, but they're still maintaining social distancing. And so it really comes down to, are you trying to use one image to tell that story, or in this case, it might come down to using multiple images and packaging them together. So for instance, if you're sending out a tweet about crowds gathering on a beach, it probably would be best to use two different shots. One, a telephoto that gives you a little bit more perspective of the depth of the crowd, but also a wider angle lens that can kind of show the space in between. However, with that wide angle lens, you're not going to be able to see the scale of the number of people. So that's why I think it's important for journalists to keep that in mind, whether or not they're tweeting out photos or posting them on Facebook and Instagram, or for page designers who are laying out a paper for the next day, is trying to use a number of images to tell a story that gives the reader or the audience the most information.
Should student journalists think about the images they put out and how people could interpret those images?
For journalists to be looking at those questions and to be thinking about what the audience is taking away from the work that they're producing, invariably ends up, asking, having you ask yourself, well, what is someone going to take from these images? With social media, you have a little bit more freedom, I think, to post multiple photos together, whereas, in print media, we often are much more pressed for space, and so you really are trying to tell a story with one image. Now, hopefully, you end up having a little bit more space on a page, and you can package things together, and then you're looking at multiple editors and photographers working together to collaborate and look at those designs and say, well, what are people taking from this? Do we need to give more context to this? And so having that collaborative effort, I think, is pretty important. But I think, by and large, students today, journalism students, are much better equipped to be asking these questions of themselves and to be responding to these situations, because our audience is becoming more savvy, and so we have to certainly keep that in mind and make sure that they feel trusted.
Can you comment about your interactions with students who aren't student journalists?
Well, I will say most of my interactions with this generation are with journalism students, but I will say that media literacy for every consumer of news really is pretty vital, and we see a lot of information circulating on social media that isn't credible, and you obviously want more people to be able to identify red flags, to say, look at the source of this and say, well, I've never heard of that. It sounds like a news operation, but it's formatted in a way that kind of makes me think that maybe this is a fly-by-night or some other quick startup where a news design or a page layout that looks like a news website is relatively easy to put together, and then just populate with completely unverified stories. And I myself, I look at things that I see on social media and say, well, okay, where was this published? It was published on Medium, for example. Medium is a great platform. I've published stories to Medium as well. But the bar for entrance there is very, very low, right? So I could write a piece and put it up 30 seconds later on Medium, and then it's being widely disseminated. But it was written by me, and I may have only given it a once through or something. There's no editing, there's no fact checking. It is important for people to be looking at the sources of their news, and I know media trust in the press is a hot button issue right now, and unfortunately, people on both sides of political ideologies are looking at journalists with a wary eye. And quite frankly, we've always been taught in journalism to look at things, things with a jaundiced eye, and to be skeptical. And so, in a way, it's good that our audience is being skeptical of what they're seeing. But it doesn't help when some people who are, let's say, journalism adjacent, who are writing stories in the same style as news, but it's completely unverified. They don't follow ethical practices. Those are types of stories and outlets that really kind of undercut our mission as journalists.
Anything else you'd like to add?
Well, one of the things that I've been sort of thinking about recently is when you had reached out and asked about kind of current college students, like where they're getting their news, and why people still look to, I hate to use the words legacy media. But if you think about like the way that we consume news, if we're, even myself, I probably consume more news stories that I found on social media than going directly to a website. But the thing to keep in mind is you have to be asking yourself, well, where does this news actually come from, right? What's the genesis of this? It only enters someone's news feed because a friend of theirs posted it. So unless you're following the New York Times, Washington Post, Baltimore Sun, LA Times, whatever, then you're getting it more or less straight from the source, albeit filtered through an algorithm. But for a lot of people, if they don't follow those news sources, those outlets, they're only seeing the things that their friends or the people that they follow found interesting. And the problem with that is I don't want to be reliant on other people's idea of what was important or what is interesting, right? So at a small newspaper or even large newspapers, we're going to cover City Hall, right? We're going to cover budget hearings, things that are incredibly boring. And we know that it's important for people to have that information. And so, as you're going through our website, through our print product, you're at least going to see the headline of that, right? And that's something that very few people, unless they're up in arms about some budget issue, very few people are going to post that to social media. So how many people are blind to that story, right? So I think that's why we are still seeing this younger generation looking at legacy media in a way that they don't necessarily have to, because there's plenty of news out there. There are plenty of sources, but right now it's all about your standards of what you can rely on, what you can put your trust in, and like I said before, that trust is the most important thing that we have.
Thank you, Graham. That was helpful. We're now going to turn to some students. Our first student is Inez Dunfak, who is a computer science student at the University of Maryland. Welcome, Inez. Inez, how often do you consume news?
I would say it's really changed since I became a college student. In high school, I would not really consume news at all, besides when my parents would be watching the news and I would just overhear it. But after college, I have changed the ways in which I consume news. So now every single day I listen to a news podcast, and I get updates about different things happening in the world, in the political sphere. I also sometimes will watch like late night talk shows. They're a little bit more comedic, but they do brush on news. And of course, like through Twitter, I get a lot of news from there. However, I will say that most of these news outlets are pretty liberal, and so I'm not always maybe getting both sides of the argument. I am aware of that. However, I've never really made an effort to seek out, I don't usually make an effort to seek out, I guess, like the other side of the argument.
How well informed do you consider yourself to be?
I would say I'm like on a scale of 1 to 10, maybe a 5 or a 6. Just because I think while I am at least a little bit more well-informed than the average ignorant citizen, I am not the most well-informed person on every single issue. I don't know fully the nuances of every single issue. I also recognize that I don't go out of my way to seek out credible news sources. I don't think that Twitter is a credible news source. People just will spew out anything on Twitter and it might be trending and people will believe it. So I do kind of intake a lot of news with a grain of salt, but I don't think I'm super well informed because of the fact that I'm not making an effort to consistently seek out the most reputable news sources.
Do you tend to believe what you read?
I don't really believe everything I see on Twitter because there's so much like emotions that go into it, and there's not a lot of fact checking. Well, now there is through the new feature, but even still, people tweet things all the time without really taking into account the credibility. As far as my other news sources, like the podcast I listen to, I will say it is truthful. I trust them. I know that they do the work and they have sources. And most other podcasts I listen to also take the time to do their due diligence and like have sources and all that kind of stuff.
Do you force yourself to think about other points of view?
Sometimes, yes, I do. Sometimes I will listen to conservative news outlets just because I want to be more informed and have the fuller picture, maybe see what's the other side's argument, so I can better make decisions for myself. And but I don't do it all the time, I will say. Yeah.
Thank you, Inez. Thank you very much. We're now going to turn to Alexandra Kalar, who studies politics and government. Alexandra, would you say that you consume news proactively?
I would say that I don't typically consume news very proactively. I typically wait for headlines to pop up on my phone, or if someone lets me know something that's going on. If I see an interesting article in someone's Facebook timeline, for example, I have sort of, as I've had less time as a college student, I've sort of strayed away from regularly reading the news at like a specific time every day. So more consuming news on like a need to know, like urgent basis, which is probably something that I should work on. In the past, there have been times when I would read the news every morning, just like updates from like the New York Times about what's going on in general. But as of now, I just sort of consume news when it comes to me type of thing. I would say that, like, because of that, I don't consume the news as frequently as I should. I'm typically consuming, like, headline news or occasionally, like, interesting opinion pieces, this type of thing. But maybe I'm checking the news at most, like, once or twice a day.
What news do you follow?
I follow a couple accounts on Instagram that are like news accounts that tend to be more like down the middle, just like say the facts, so I can sort of just keep up day to day. And, you know, sometimes I'll read those comments and that sort of forces me to see, you know, there's a lot of people who have different opinions than me and they're voicing those opinions in the comments. And that's just one way that I sort of am able to like acknowledge that, you know, a lot of the times I'm just hearing the same opinions from people who agree with me. So that's one way that I can sort of see other people's opinions. But I think in general, I should probably do more of consuming news that I normally wouldn't, because then I can sort of at least understand where other people are coming from, like what they're consuming and how that influences their thinking.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you for those very frank answers. We're now going to turn to Rob Lloyd, who studies philosophy and film. Rob, can you say a word or two about how you consume news?
Well, I use Reddit a lot, so I often hear a lot of news through there. I also kind of more or less rely on news updates through friends and family, so a rather biased lens. And it's sort of when I, like, you know, I guess, look for news on my own, I'll go to sources like The Atlantic or, I don't know, Washington Post, New York or whatever. So all relatively liberal sources. I'm a rather liberal sort of leaning person myself. So that's how I consume news. I don't really check at any particular time of the day. I use Reddit sort of interspersed throughout the day. So really anytime.
Do you consider yourself well-informed?
No, not really. I don't really consider myself well-informed. I don't really put in effort to get a well-rounded sort of perspective on issues. I'm pretty content with hearing biased takes, which I admit is a real problem.
How about the quality or truthfulness of what you're reading?
I don't know about the quality truthfulness. I put a lot of trust usually just kind of in what I'm hearing. I don't believe people are often like malicious in how they sort of report news. They just, the inaccuracies within reported news comes from unintentional, maybe sort of almost subconscious perhaps bias and assumptions that can just kind of happen, which again is not ideal. It should be more truthful in that, hopefully, but I kind of just blindly trust what I hear, more or less. Although I employ some amount of skepticism, and I try to have some restraint from judging issues before I have enough information. But I don't verify very much. But I am a bit skeptical, I guess.
Do you think about other points of view?
I like to think of myself as a very thoughtful guy, so I usually try to think of issues just personally from a maybe somewhat well-rounded lens, although I don't think I usually approach things from perhaps a well-rounded enough approach. I don't think I look for different sort of media outlets and different people's perspectives on issues so much, but I'm very open to hearing other people's takes, for sure. And I like to think I have some amount of restraint and consideration for the perspectives I hear. And, in regards to taking it for the complete truth. But I like to be I like to be well-rounded in my, I like to think I'm well-rounded in my assumptions and perceptions of issues. And so these topics, they're usually rather contentious issues. As someone very interested in philosophy, I like to spend a lot of time thinking about issues that are particularly, controversial.
Why do you tend to consume certain types of news as opposed to other types of news?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm very sort of driven to, I'm very receptive to visual mediums, especially like film. Personally, I'm very invested in film as a medium overall. So I guess I'm very inclined to looking at, video media. But I read as well. I certainly read as well. So I'll hear what people have to write about issues. Although I don't think I consume articles very much. But and I also listen to podcasts sometimes. But if there's really any, off the top of my head, any sort of type of news, if I'm going to interpret this type as a medium, if there's any type of news I consume the least, it's probably like radio, because I just don't use the radio ever.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you to all our guests for your contributions today. And special thanks to our 2 assistant producers and to the Fund for American Studies. And of course, thank you to our viewers for joining us for another edition of Higher Education Today. If you have comments that you'd like to send directly to me, please go ahead and do so at highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you again for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Stephen Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.